It's June of 1775. The spark of the American Revolution, ignited just months earlier at Lexington and Concord, has now burst into a raging fire. Boston is the epicenter, a city simmering with tension, occupied by the might of the British military. But outside its walls, a new defiant colonial army is gathering, itching for another chance to prove their mettle. They know a fundamental truth of warfare. To control the city, you must control the high ground. And overlooking Boston are two key hills, Bunker Hill and the slightly smaller Breed's Hill. This is where our story begins. A story of a battle that, on paper, was a loss for the colonists, but in reality became a stunning psychological victory that would shake the British Empire to its core and forge a new, unified American spirit. This is the story of the Battle of Bunker Hill. To truly grasp the weight of this moment, let's paint a picture of Boston at the time. The British commander, General Thomas Gay, is effectively a prisoner in his own headquarters. He and his thousands of professional soldiers are trapped. Encircling the city is a sprawling, ragtag army of colonial militia, men from all over New England who have answered the call to arms. They've laid siege to Boston, cutting it off from the mainland. Gage knows this is an untenable position. He needs to break out, and his plan is to seize the hills on the Charlestown Peninsula, Bunker and Breed's Hills. From there, his powerful cannons could rain down fire on the city, the harbor, and the rebel camps. But the colonists had a secret weapon, an incredibly effective intelligence network. The Committee of Safety, the Patriots' governing body, got wind of Gage's plan. They couldn't let the British take that high ground. They had to act first. So, on the night of June 16th, a force of about 1,200 colonial troops, led by Colonel William Prescott, was given a daring and dangerous order: march under the cloak of darkness and fortify Bunker Hill. But here, history takes a fascinating and still debated turn. For reasons we don't fully understand, maybe it was a misinterpretation of orders. Maybe a bold, tactical gamble. Prescott and his men bypassed Bunker Hill. Instead, they moved to Breed's Hill, a lower but much closer position to the British forces in Boston. This was an audacious, in-your-face move. They were essentially building a fortress right under the noses of the most powerful army on Earth. All through that night, these men, farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, now soldiers, worked with a silent, feverish intensity. With shovels and pickaxes, they carved a redoubt out of the earth, a small, enclosed fort about 160 feet long, with walls 6 feet high. It was an astonishing feat of grit and engineering, completed in just a few short hours of darkness. As the sun rose on the morning of June 17th, the crew of the British warship HMS Lively, anchored in the Charles River, stared in utter disbelief. Where there had been an empty hill the night before, there was now a formidable fort, with a rebel flag flying defiantly from its walls. Without hesitation, the Lively's cannons roared to life, and the Battle of Bunker Hill had begun. The British commanders in Boston were furious. General Gage, seeing the colonists' handiwork, felt it as a personal insult. This wasn't just a military problem anymore. It was a matter of honor. He had to crush this impudent rebellion and teach the colonists a lesson they would never, ever forget. He assigned the task to his second-in-command, General William Howe. Howe was a respected, battle-hardened veteran, but he was about to make a fatal miscalculation. He looked at the men on that hill and saw not a real army, but a disorganized mob of farmers. He believed they would break and run at the first sight of his disciplined, professional soldiers. So, instead of taking the logical route, lending troops behind the colonists to cut off their only retreat and trapping them, Howe chose a direct, frontal assault. He was supremely confident that his redcoats, marching in their perfect, intimidating lines, would simply sweep up the hill and brush the rebels aside. It was a decision driven by arrogance, one that would cost him dearly. Around 3 in the afternoon, the assault began. Thousands of British soldiers were ferried across the river from Boston, landing on the shores of the Charlestown Peninsula. They formed up in long, immaculate lines, their redcoats a terrifying sea of crimson, and began their slow, methodical march up the grassy slopes of Breed's Hill. Inside the earthen fort, the mood was a tense mix of fear and fierce determination. The colonial soldiers were low on everything, but most critically, they were low on gunpowder. This scarcity led to one of the most legendary orders in American history. Colonel Prescott, knowing that every single shot had to find its mark, repeatedly told his men, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." This wasn't for dramatic effect. It was a desperate, practical command. Their muskets were inaccurate at long range, and they simply could not afford to waste a single round sauté white. They gripped their muskets, their knuckles white, and watched the British line advance, bayonets glinting in the afternoon sun. Closer and closer they came. 100 yards, 75 yards, 50 yards. The tension must have been suffocating. And then the order was given. Fire. A massive, coordinated volley of musket fire erupted from the top of the hill. The sound was deafening. The effect on the British lines was catastrophic. The front rank of redcoats simply collapsed, mowed down in an instant. Soldiers fell by the dozens. The perfectly disciplined regulars, who had expected a disorganized volley and a hasty retreat, were staggered by the deadly, disciplined fire from the rebel mob. The survivors hesitated, their lines shattered, and then they broke, retreating in disarray back down the hill. A massive cheer erupted from the American lines. They had done the impossible. They had repelled the greatest army in the world. But the British were professionals. General Howe, though visibly stunned by the savage resistance, was not a man to quit. He rallied his troops, reorganized their lines, and ordered a second assault. Once again, the sea of red marched up the hill, and once again, the colonists held their fire, letting them get dangerously close. The result was the same. A second shattering volley tore through the British ranks, inflicting even more carnage than the first. The slopes of Breed's Hill were now littered with the red uniforms of the dead and dying. For a second time, the world's most disciplined army broke and fled. Reports from the battle say entire British companies were virtually annihilated. The psychological impact was profound. For the British officers, it was a waking nightmare. They had never witnessed such ferocity from an irregular force. General Howe himself was in the thick of it, and his entire staff of aides was either killed or wounded at his side. But for all their bravery, the Americans were in a desperate situation. Their ammunition was almost gone. As the British prepared for a third assault, the colonists were reduced to scavenging cartridges from their fallen comrades, some having only 1 or 2 shots left. This time, the British soldiers, ordered to fix bayonets, charged up the hill without even stopping to fire. They were exhausted, enraged, and determined to take the fort. The colonists fired their last few volleys, but it wasn't enough to stop the charge. The redcoats swarmed over the earthen walls. The fighting descended into brutal, hand-to-hand combat. The colonists, out of ammunition and lacking bayonets, fought back with the butts of their muskets, with rocks, with their bare hands. But it was a losing fight. Among the last to fall was Dr. Joseph Warren, a charismatic leader of the rebellion and a newly appointed general. His death was a devastating blow to the Patriot cause. Finally, Colonel Prescott, realizing the position was lost, gave the order to retreat. His men fought their way out, falling back through Charlestown as the British finally took the hill. The battle was over. Tactically, the British had won. They had achieved their objective and taken the high ground, but it was a victory that felt like a defeat. The cost was staggering. Over 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded, nearly half of the attacking force. For the Americans, casualties were around 450. The British had captured a hill, but the colonists had captured something far more valuable: self-respect and the respect of their enemy. One British general grimly remarked, "A few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America." The battle proved that American militia, when properly led and fighting for a cause they believed in, could stand up to the best professional soldiers in the world. It shattered the myth of British invincibility and sent a shockwave through London. News of the battle electrified the colonies. Far from being a lesson in submission, it was a call to arms. It transformed the skirmish into a full-blown war and solidified the colonies' resolve to fight for their independence. The Battle of Bunker Hill, fought on Breed's Hill, became a symbol of American courage and a rallying cry for the revolution. It showed the world that this wasn't just a rabble of rebels. This was an army, fighting for a nation yet to be born. For the Americans, this was a moment of incredible validation. These everyday men, farmers and artisans, had stood their ground against the elite of the British Army. They had pushed them back, not just once, but twice. But that success came at a steep price. Their ammunition was now dangerously low. As the British readied themselves for a third assault, many of the colonial soldiers were down to their last few rounds, and some had none at all. In desperation, they started loading their muskets with whatever they could. Fine nails, small stones, anything. They knew they couldn't hold off another attack the way they had before. For the third and final assault, the British commanders changed their strategy. They'd identified the central redoubt as the main colonial strongpoint. This time, they would concentrate their forces there. They ordered their soldiers to drop their heavy packs, which weighed over 60 pounds, and to advance at a quicker pace. The plan was to rely on the bayonet, not musket fire. As the sea of redcoats surged up the hill for the third time, the colonial defenders unleashed what little firepower they had left. The volleys staggered the British advance, but it just wasn't enough to stop them. The British soldiers swarmed over the earthen walls of the redoubt. What followed was brutal, close quarters, hand-to-hand combat. The colonists, lacking bayonets for most of their muskets, fought back desperately with the butts of their guns, with swords, and even with rocks. But they were out of ammunition and completely overwhelmed. In these final, chaotic moments, a key figure in the defense was killed. Dr. Joseph Warren, a respected leader of the Massachusetts Patriots who had volunteered to fight as a private soldier, fell in the fighting. His death was a tremendous blow to the Patriot cause. Seeing that the position was lost, Colonel Prescott gave the order to retreat. The colonists fell back, fighting a chaotic but surprisingly effective rearguard action as they withdrew from the peninsula. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, the battle was over. The British had taken the ground. They had captured Breed's Hill and, subsequently, the unoccupied Bunker Hill. In purely tactical terms, it was a British victory. They had achieved their objective, but the cost was staggering, far beyond anything they could have imagined. Out of the roughly 2,300 British soldiers who had participated in the attacks, over 1,000 were either killed or wounded. That's a casualty rate of nearly 45%. It was the highest British casualty rate of the entire Revolutionary War. One British officer grimly noted, "A few more such victories would have surely put an end to British dominion in America." On the American side, the losses were much lighter, estimated at around 450 killed, wounded, or captured. They had lost the ground, but they had won something far more valuable. The Battle of Bunker Hill, as it came to be known, was a massive moral victory. It proved that the colonial militia, these so-called amateur soldiers, could stand up to the disciplined, professional British Army in a pitched battle. They hadn't run away at the first sign of trouble. They had fought with incredible courage and skill, and they had inflicted devastating losses on their enemy. News of the battle spread like wildfire through the colonies. It shattered the myth of British invincibility. It showed everyone that this was not going to be a short, Isluan conflict for the crown. It emboldened the Patriots and galvanized support for the newly formed Continental Army. George Washington would arrive to take command of the army outside Boston just a few weeks later, inheriting a force that was now filled with a newfound confidence. The Battle of Bunker Hill transformed the conflict from a small-scale rebellion into a full-scale war. It forced the British to take the American military threat seriously, and it unified the colonies with a shared sense of purpose and a belief that they could, in fact, win their independence. The sight of those redcoats falling on the slopes of Breed's Hill demonstrated that the fight for liberty would be paid for in blood, but that it was a price the Americans were willing to pay. The battle was a brutal, bloody affair, but it was also the moment the American Revolution truly found its resolve. It may have been a loss on the map, but it was a profound victory in the hearts and minds of the American people, setting the stage for the long and difficult road to independence. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this piece of history as fascinating as I do, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the pivotal moments that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments what other historical battles you'd like to see covered. Until next time, stay curious.